The public was a disposable asset from both the government's and businesses' viewpoint. Like lambs to the slaughter, their income was seized by fiat by the Internal Revenue Department, even though the amendment to the Constitution that legalized the nefarious government theft of wealth from the public had never been properly ratified by the requisite number of states. Illegal IRS courts were instituted that ignored the basic rights guaranteed by the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. The Napoleonic concept of presumed guilt was made a matter of policy in the IRS courts. The right of trial by jury was ignored, as well as the concept of precedent, freedom from seizure without court order, and the right of legal counsel. As far as the IRS was concerned, the Constitution didn't exist. The IRS wrote the administrative law, judged the offenders, and executed the sentence. There was no appeal except through the IRS courts. The IRS was above the law and the Constitution. When Congress objected, they told the assembled politicians that if the IRS had to obey the Constitution, they would be hamstrung. Money would stop flowing in to fund the pork barrel projects that kept the politicos in office. The committee looked at each other and saw their political demise if the money to their districts stopped flowing. They nodded in silent agreement with each other and ruled that the IRS could continue in its activities despite the clear violations of almost every article of the Constitution. Law was one thing and political reality was another. The odious activities of the IRS were allowed to continue unhindered by law, common sense, or custom. Legislation was passed to allow the FBI to spy upon the personal lives and politics of the public. To ensure that the egregious invasions of privacy by the FBI could not be reported by the theoretically free American press, a law was passed making the act of using the FBI's name in print or film illegal unless the FBI gave its consent. The fact that the director of the FBI bragged to everyone he met that he had incriminating photos and records of every member of Congress had nothing to do with the alacrity with which Congress passed the law. The congressmen were only doing their public duty. No one even wanted to talk about the Federal Reserve System. Ostensibly, it was an arm of the federal government, but in reality it was a privately owned corporation whose shares sold for $50,000 apiece by federal law. Money was sold to the Federal Reserve System at the cost of printing, i.e., each banknote had an average cost of 0.0183 cents each in 1969 and rose only slight over the preceding years, no matter what the denomination of the banknote. The Federal Reserve banks lent the money at a rate determined by the chairman of the reserve system, and skimmed off 2% for management purposes, i.e., administrative and dividends to the investors. By law, the banks were permitted to lend 10 times the amount of money they had purchased from the Treasury. In other words, the government gave money to the rich to be sold to the poor for interest rates determined by the rich. Instead of being a fair-minded arm of the Treasury, the Federal Reserve System was a charity program for the ultra-rich. It was an exclusive club whose fees merely required a minimum of $50,000 worth of pocket money to buy a single share of stock. The people who were members of this exclusive club were most often the ones who complained the loudest about how much money government was spending on feeding and clothing the poor. Unknown to the American populace, the rich were the largest consumers of public welfare in the United States. It was unfortunate for America as a whole that the public never realized their error in trusting the government. The trust built by 2 world wars had distorted the traditional American suspicion of government. The currency of the time had "In God We Trust" stamped on the face of each coin or banknote. The public should have prayed for release from the bonds of the fiat currency that the government had knowingly shackled them with. Indeed, prayer was the only true answer to the tyranny under which they labored. In short, the public needed a miracle to be free again.